Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's Wednesday afternoon, so I'm actually doing these basically a full day early because to be honest with you, I want to spend all day tomorrow uninterrupted testing that TV because the way my ADHD brain works, I really need no interruptions. I need to dig in deep when I'm doing some of the extra crazy comparison stuff to make sure I got it all in my head. So hopefully none of the supporters feel like I'm putting you second to a TV, but also hopefully anybody who owns one of these or was about to buy one or owns one similar might be able to benefit from some of the stuff that I'm learning, including how to test yourself, which is always something I try to teach at least a little bit in each video. So that way you could verify any of the stuff yourself if you feel like it. But anyway, enough rambling. Let's jump in and see what questions we got so far this week. Starting us out on Floatplane, Shorjor said he bought the CRT projector that was mentioned last week. Awesome. It's huge. Yeah, and heavy too, right? Way heavier than you would expect because you got to remember you have 3 CRTs in one package. So it's like you're holding, three 10-inch CRTs all at the same time. So yeah, massively huge. But let me continue. It's been in a well-ventilated, warm storage room for the past 9 years. The tubes don't have the slightest burn-in, and overall the whole projector is in good shape. They've tested the projector, but it doesn't start, and when trying to turn on, a relay on the horizontal deflection board clicks repeatedly. Maybe the voltages from the PSU drop when it tries to turn on. They'll start troubleshooting, checking capacitors, traces, solder joints, and voltages on the power supply first, and afterwards they'll check the other boards. Is there any equipment I'd recommend when servicing CRTs? They have a multimeter, soldering iron, and tools to disassemble everything gently. So Steve from RetroTech is obviously the person I'm going to refer to here. I would definitely check out his videos, but the one thing I would add is a discharge tool, which essentially could just be a screwdriver with some wire on it if you wanted to. Now, always try to have your own protection when doing it. Make sure to have a screwdriver that has a plastic handle with no metal sticking through where you're going to be holding it. Sand down or scuff up the screwdriver on both the pointy end where you're going to be doing the discharging as well as where you wrap the wire around it. You could buy a CRT discharge tool, but it's literally the same thing. So I would do that, wrap the wire around it a bunch of times, then wrap that with non-conductive tape. And that way, every time you need to discharge the 3 tubes, you just plug it into something metal. I often use these metal racks I have here, and that way you could discharge it. Watch Steve's videos for it. I always have to say, the chance of you dying while discharging a CRT is not zero. And the stupid analogy I always make is unless you're doing it in a bathtub, there is zero chance of you dying when you mod a Super Nintendo or something like that. So just always keep that in mind whenever you're working on anything CRT based, as those things hold charge for a long time and it could potentially be very dangerous. But if you do it right and you're safe, not really, but still keep the caution in mind. So that's definitely the only other tool I would recommend. As far as possibly checking the deflection board, any forums or anything out there that has people that already have worked on these things are usually your best bet because general recommendations are good, but a lot of these things, you'll like, oh, model number 123 from brand X. Well, on the deflection board, it's always this part that fails. Like us nerds are really good at keeping track of stuff like that. So hopefully you could find exactly what's going on with that model, but and I don't know if Steve has much experience. Well, I should say as much experience with projectors as he does regular tubes, but I mean, it's always worth asking a question over there as well. And of course, if anybody in the chat has CRT projectors and run into stuff like this, please, jump in, throw in the comments and see, and maybe point them in the right direction. And just one polite reminder, the way YouTube comments work, not on the support services, but on YouTube, if you put a link to something, it just disappears. It doesn't even show up in my held for review bin. So if you have a suggestion, just type out, go to forum name, search for term and, stuff like that. So it doesn't automatically get deleted. Now, moving over to Patreon, a couple of questions from Jason Guffey. First, Jason was thinking about routing HDMI consoles through a PC's capture card in order to apply graphical effects through the OBS window to try to improve the graphics while gaming. And they were wondering if I thought that was a good idea and if that's something that it would be too much latency to game on. And the short answer is, yeah, it's going to be too much latency in most cases. But if you go through and check out Epos Vox's data sheet, which you already referenced in here anyway, he's got ones or puts things together for this exact scenario. So you could see which capture cards have the least amount of latency through an OBS window. So you might be able to get it down to a point where it's bearable. And I personally do this all the time for capturing and testing. And when I do it that way, I am noticeably worse at games. Now, I'm not a great player anyway, so that definitely factors into it. I'd be willing to bet pro gamers would be able to do a lot better, but I also think that they might even notice the differences more because they're used to their own pro level setups. So my opinion on that is if you're just looking to mess around to see, play a casual couple of games, or if you're just looking to do a specific game, do that, play it. But then you're really going to want to keep in mind that this isn't the best overall experience because of the latency. And then you need to decide, well, what type of game is it? And do these graphical enhancements make enough of a difference for it to be worth it? So if it's like a turn-by-turn role-playing game and you smooth things out in a way where it looks so much better, yeah, go for it. But if it's like a fighting game, no, absolutely not. I would not recommend it. But it's something that's worth playing with, and it's also something that might help you for future captures or anything. So let's say you want to take older games and apply certain filters and stuff to them so that your streams or your captured video looks a specific way. Yeah, this would be worth running some experiments and then, using your typical either pass-through or HDMI splitter so you game on one monitor and capture on the other. But as far as just gaming through an OBS window, most people just wouldn't do that because of the latency and anything else that might happen. That's totally up to you. I do know people that do it, but I don't know anybody, even the people that do it, I don't think they would try to tell people that's a great way of playing a game. I think they just do it for the convenience factor. Second, Jason was wondering about heat dissipation in modern motherboards. Jason's got a X570 chipset AMD board that has a pretty common issue in that the south bridge is in a bad spot, so it conducts and absorbs heat from the rest of the system. So whenever you're talking about stuff like this, you need to move heat away from the components and out of the case. And that is going to be the same no matter what era of PC, no matter what motherboard layout it is. So if this is something that's concerning, that you think your motherboard might die as a result, definitely jump on and see what other people are doing. You could buy a cheap thermal probe kit so that you could either run it through the motherboard to verify its readings, or you could just have it, the wire run out to like a cheap multimeter or something that could do thermal stuff. The thermal probe kits are very cheap on Amazon though. So if it's something you would use more than once, maybe pick one of those up. But I would try different cheap solutions to see what happens. Throwing a heatsink on it, throwing a different fan next to it might be fine. You could get crazy and you could do like copper heat mover things with you could go above and beyond with this. I actually had an idea when I was like, I don't know, 17 years old that I saw people do like 10 years later, which was, what if you submerge your entire computer, minus the, spinning drives and stuff like that. What if you submerge it in non-conductive liquid and then you use liquid nitrogen to cool all the hottest spots, but you use metal tubes to run the liquid nitrogen. So the metal tubes would cool down the non-conductive liquid, and then the liquid nitrogen cools down the hottest chips. So, and then you just have like, not fans, but just things to move the water around. So the water is non-conductive fluid is constantly moving, so that you're always just trying to keep the overall temperature down. And I told a couple of people that over the years, and some of them laughed in my face. Some of them said it was a great idea, but it's really dangerous to work with liquid nitrogen. You need permits to buy it. And, then I walked into Computex in Taiwan, I think in the late 2000s, like about a decade later. And there was exactly that. They were overclocking something to a level that had never been done before up until that point. And I just laughed. I was like, well, I guess many of us nerds think alike. So, Jason, if you really want to submerge your PC in non-conductive fluid and run a liquid nitrogen cooling to it, please do lots of videos on that. But also, please don't die. It can be very, very easy to get hurt with that. But yeah, so don't go too crazy, but there's a couple of things that you could do, just like adding heat sinks, taking readings before and after. That's always important to make sure that you're actually proving that your results matter. There's a lot of little things you could do. So just kind of play with it, see what you got. And I wouldn't go too crazy, because you could end up dropping a lot of time and money and not make a difference anyway. So yeah, it was a fun question. One more from Jason. They're curious on what my thoughts are on wireless charging. They don't have very many devices that could even do it, but they don't know enough about it to know if it's worth looking into or not. On the one hand, the idea of being able to leave their various game controllers to just sit and charge in a designated spot is exciting, but on the other hand, they don't know if it causes long-term damage to the overall health of the batteries. And to reiterate, most devices, especially controllers, don't even support it at all, so the idea of not having to fiddle with any charging cables is still a long ways off, but maybe we'll have swappable batteries at some point that will allow for it. So overall, I kind of had my reservations about it, to be honest with you. I wondered about heat. I wondered about how dropping like a paper clip on it by accident might affect that. But once I got a phone that supported it, I got a super cheap charger on purpose. I bought like kind of a crappy one because I figured if something was going to go wrong, it would probably be with that instead of a name brand one. And I think it's great. I don't have any problems with it. The only thing I'll note is that if you're consciously plugging in your controllers to charge them and then unplugging them when you're done, that's probably better for battery health than just leaving it essentially plugged in all the time, because that's what you would be doing, leaving it on the wireless charging pads. And if you have something like a cell phone that's programmed for stuff like this, it could know that it's doing wireless charging, assume that you're probably going to like leave it overnight and change the way the battery charges to improve the health of the battery. But whenever you have stuff with built-in batteries, I mean, anybody that owns a PSP already knows what I'm about to say. The battery health is important. Otherwise, you could damage it. It could do that, bubbling out thing. So I don't know. That's kind of the downside of having controllers with batteries built in, is you need to pay a lot more attention to that than something like a wired controller or, that uses removable batteries in some way. So I don't know. I think if you're somebody who uses something all the time, like a cell phone, wireless charging is great. It's convenient. You plop it down on it, you pick it up the next day, you keep going. But I think if you're not using something all the time, just letting it go down to nothing and then plugging it in to charge and then unplugging it when it's done is a good idea. And the one thing I do run into sometimes is I'll grab a controller and there'll barely be any battery life left because it's sat on the shelf in standby mode for 6 months. So those are where those cheap portable battery packs, like the USB ones, really come in handy. You just sit one of those next to you, you plug a USB cable in and you charge while you play, and it's technically now a wired controller, but you have it sitting on your lap and it's not, or next to you or something. It's not that big a deal. But yeah, that's just my thoughts, but I'm not an expert on it. So I'd love to hear anybody else's thoughts on wireless charging. Am I missing something? Is there potential benefits or dangers of that? I'm really just kind of telling you my experience, but I should have opened with, I'm not an expert and I'm just guessing. I'm usually good about telling everybody when I'm just kind of pulling stuff out of my butt here, but I guess I forgot this time. So yeah, please correct me if I'm wrong. Next up, David Madden wanted to just talk a little bit about CRT projectors. A couple years ago, they found a CRT projector free on Facebook Marketplace. Very jealous, by the way. I would love to have one here to mess with, but let me continue. And they connected several 240p consoles to it, but they were unable to get light gun games to work. However, that could have been due to poor light control in the room they were using. So light guns should work, but you do need to make sure that, and with a projector setup, that the room is dark enough and the projector is bright enough in order for it to work properly. But they should work as long as you're connecting it directly and not having any kind of processor between. But CRT projectors should accept or 240p without a problem anyway. Also, setup is straightforward, assuming you could find the online manual, but requires many steps, plus the initial physical placement of the projector matters greatly. However, these beasts are old and mechanical, and electrical problems are the real challenge, not the setup. So I agree completely, and that's one of the reasons I haven't set out to spend a lot of money on one. First, because it's not something I would be comfortable mounting to my ceiling, and it might even actually have to be low enough where I'd hit my head on it when I walked by it. So I would have to put it on like a tall rolling cart, and then I'd have to like mark off on my floor with painter's tape or something where the cart goes, so I wouldn't have to recalibrate it every time. And then it's all of the downsides of a CRT. You still have caps and deflection boards, just like Shurzor was talking about over on Float Plane. So yeah, I really do want one, and I'm super interested to see how 1080p 72 looks. I also was talking to Mark from Blurbusters about potentially putting 3D Blu-rays through it at either 1080p 96, if that's even possible. I don't think that the most CRT projectors would be able to handle that high of a bandwidth, but you could also drop it down to 720p 120 and probably do that. So I'm super interested in seeing how all of that stuff would look. My guess, just gut feeling, is if the projector was decent enough, older movies would look insanely good on them. but when you came to a lot of the newer stuff, it'd probably be a fun experience, just like how a brand new projector is always fun to pull down a giant screen. It makes you feel like you're at a movie theater. But I think if you had a choice, most people would pick a similar sized OLED instead for almost every scenario. But I still would really love one. Also, David mentioned Kurt Palmy's old CRT Projector website. I've been on that site for 25 years now or something like that. I remember having a Luva Aconda. Aconda was the cheaper one. Articos was the more expensive, right? But I had the Aconda first, and it wouldn't accept a 480p signal through component, so you needed to get a VGA adapter. But also, since it was analog, it couldn't accept HDMI, and if you just used a converter, there was HDCP issues. So essentially, people with very expensive Luva TVs, I got mine used and super cheap compared to what they cost, which is kind of how I've always bought CRTs or TVs. But people in that scenario are the same as people with CRT projectors. And if you just spent $20,000 on a Sony projector, and now you can't use HDMI, you're going to want an HDCP defeating device. So that was my first entry into that world, was Kurt Palmy's website. So yeah, that's a good one. I'll see if it's still available, and I'll leave a link just for people that are curious about that stuff. But thanks for sharing your thoughts. And yeah, I would love to someday mess with one and see how much I actually use it. Next up, Katazuma Gaming has a couple of questions about their setup. I read every word of the question, but just in the interest of everybody's time, I'm going to skip through the ends of most of these. But the questions first are, they pre-ordered the Flippy drive in order to get Swiss on their GameCube to then allow them to force 480p for most of the games, which is the lowest resolution their HDMI to component box allows, which makes sense. That's kind of the way things are these days. Is this the best setup? Yeah, I think so. I just think if you're going into something like a RetroTink 5X like you are, into an OLED, then you're going to want 480p wherever possible on your GameCube. And using something like a Carby and then one of these HDMI to component converters is going to get you as good of a setup as you could imagine that could run on CRTs that are multi-format compatible, as well as anything like any scaler like that. Also, should they do the same for their PlayStation 3? No, for PS2 and PS3, I would just get component video cables and not really worry about it. You could then set them both to, like the PS2, you would have to launch in 480i and then switch over to 480p per game, but the Tink 5X can handle that no problem through the component video inputs. And on the flip side, the PS2 and 3 can do 480p over SCART, however, not on the RetroTink 5X's SCART input. That doesn't do sync on green. So I would just do component video cables for both. The HD Retrovision ones are excellent. They're equal to or better than the original Sony's, and they're fairly priced because there's no circuitry in that one. It's just, the console plug to the cable end. So I would definitely recommend that for those. Next, are there any good component and S-Video switches for the RetroTink 5X that I could recommend so they don't need to plug between S-Video and component? So you could do a couple of different things. You, first of all, could just use like an Extron crosspoint, and you could mix and match inputs like that. You could pick up the SVS, Arthremis's scalable video switch, and just have different inputs going to different outputs. And on the output side, you could just use the VGA out and then break that out into a VGA to BNC or RCA cable, and you could feed everything to the different outputs there. I would really think about total setup though, and are you going to keep the Tink 5X? Are you eventually going to upgrade to the CE or Pro? Like, total setup would make a big difference, because if you told me, eventually you're going to get a Tink 4K Pro, I would say get the SVS, get all the different modules, and that way you could route everything auto through it at some point. So that's really something you're going to have to think about. Getting a used crosspoint and some adapters would also work. It's also kind of a pain to deal with all those plugs and adapters in there, but if you don't mind tinkering a bit, that should be totally fine. And you could also just buy some cheaper component and S-Video switches and try to link them together, but now you're talking about making custom cables, and if this is something you're into, let me know and we could go through how weird you could get. But as far as a general recommendation goes, the SVS or the crosspoints are probably the best way to go if you're going to mix all these different signals. Next, are those the best inputs for each console, or were there any mistakes? So I read through all of your consoles, and it looks like everything is fine other than the PS2 and 3. I would definitely get component video cables. That would, for all the reasons I just said. But, and GameCube, you already said that you're going to be getting the HDMI converter for it. So no, I think you're completely on the right track for everything. The only thing you could do is if you wanted to remove RGB altogether, you can get the HD Retrovision for cables for the PlayStation 1. You would just, I think it's the Genesis 2 cable and the PlayStation 1 adapter, and then you wouldn't need RGB for anything. You would just be running everything through component video and not have to worry. And, that could allow you to route everything through just a component video switch. So that's also something to think about. But, total solution. Always think about that, because it's so easy to accidentally say, oh, I'm only spend $60 on this and that's all I need. Or, oh, I got to spend $300 on that. Well, that's too much. But take a step back and you might actually realize that one overall might be cheaper than the other over time. So everybody's situation is different. So it's just, whatever your total setup is definitely going to be the answer. And bonus question, their GameCube has some weird vertical lines in Wind Waker. Apparently there's a setting that will fix or at least minimize the issue. I totally forgot. I'm really sorry. I would definitely check out any of the documentation and, any of the Discord servers that talk about Swiss, because everybody who works with that and who uses it on a regular basis loves finding all of the solutions to this and sharing the info with everybody else as well. So I would just, if anybody happens to know that, by the way, please let us know in the comments. But that seems like something that the info would be out there somewhere, maybe even in a wiki somewhere for that. So all good questions. Sounds like you have an awesome setup, and let me know if you have any other questions or if I got any of these wrong. Next up, Danny Funker recently got a Llama ITX motherboard, which is like a new retro board. Lou from Lou's Retro Source did a video on it a while back. I'll post a link for anybody who's interested. It looks really cool. However, it keeps hanging in Windows 98 SE in 2000 after they install the GPU drivers. Someone on the Llama Discord has a different issue, and a repaste resolves their issue. Their GPU seems to have some kind of yellowish glue that was securing the heatsink to the GPU. How could they remove it? They've tried 99% isopropyl alcohol, but didn't get anywhere. So let's break this down a little bit. If your computer is booting with this card in, it's just loading a generic VGA driver, and then after you load its driver, it stops working, my gut's telling me the problem is the driver. Now, there absolutely is a scenario in which, in this, limp mode, let's call it, the GPU isn't really kicking in too hard. So if it was an issue of heat or something was wrong with the system, capacitors are bad on the card, it is not impossible that you're going to have this exact scenario. It'll work before you load the drivers because it's not actually using any of the power of the GPU. It's just feeding generic video to the system. And then once you kick that GPU processor in, something is failing. So that's, that is possible, but I would start with the drivers, and I would double and triple check that somebody else with that exact same Sapphire Radeon 9250 is having, try that driver that they're using and see what happens. Try alternatives, try official, try Sapphire, whatever you could find. Because while 98 SE and 2000 weren't nearly as much of a headache as drivers on Windows 95 and NT or 3.1, the old people out there remember all that nightmare. It still isn't as easy as it is today. So drivers first. At that point, if you really want to dig in to see if it's a hardware issue, visual check is always the best thing to do. Are any capacitors bulging out, or is there sticky fluid underneath or around them? That's obviously something you want to check. Any damage, any weirdness, any scrapes, is it clean? If you tried 99% isopropyl, then I'm assuming it's clean, but, take a look at all of that and see what you have. At absolute last resort, you could hit it with some heat and see what happens. But I want to be very, very clear about this. If this is an expensive graphics card, or if it's your childhood Sapphire ATI 9250, don't do this. Talk to other people with the same exact card, see if they've had the issue, see what they did to fix it. But if you're no, I got this for $5 at a thrift store. I don't really care about it. Yeah, then look, hit it with some heat. I've had that absolutely work before. Just be aware of what you're doing. Anytime you heat something up, you heat everything around it too. So make sure to, if you have some non-conductive or Kapton tape, put it around the other components. Aim around the bottom of the heat sink, so you really are just trying to hit the GPU as much as you can. Don't do it too long. Don't hold the nozzle in one spot for too long. But hitting it with some heat, waiting for it to cool down a little bit, and then plugging it in and trying it. I've absolutely had that fixed GPUs before. I've had it fix some that like permanently, which makes me think there was maybe something else wrong too. I don't know, but I would only suggest that if there's a zero repercussion scenario. So that's, I just want to make sure I'm clear about that. And my advice isn't, oh, I have GPU problems, let's hit it with a heat gun and, see if I fix it. But as a last resort, yeah, you never know. Maybe that's just going to kick this thing in for you a little bit more. But I mean, those are my suggestions to start. But when it's a driver issue, my gut almost always goes to try different drivers first. But it could definitely be a hardware issue as well. So let us know how you make out, because that's pretty interesting. And that's something that might end up being a fun story for anybody who uses retro graphics cards, or maybe it's a Llama ITX issue. Who knows? Maybe that's going to be an interesting solution. Well, that's it for this week. I should be back to my normal Thursday early morning recording of the Q&As, so I'm sorry for anybody who was about to get their question in. And just a reminder, please ask any questions you have wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post. And if you see this video pop up and your question was missed, it's only because you put the question in after I was done recording, but maybe the video hadn't gone up on YouTube yet or something like that. So any question at all, just please put it wherever it is you support in the latest Q&A post. And as always, thanks to everybody for participating in these, and of course for supporting in any way possible, because it really is you who's keeping all this stuff going. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.